A grieving millionaire walks into a park with a rope in his pocket, ready to end it all, until a black child quietly offers him a broken toy car to save her mother. He thought his story was over. He was wrong. What would you do if a stranger's pain reopened your heart? If stories of second chances matter to you, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and is it morning or night where you are? It was a gray October morning, the kind where the air sits heavy with silence, and the world seems to move a little slower, as if waiting for something to end. William Holmes walked the narrow path through Marlowe Park, a well-kept but quiet corner of the city he had once taken his son to. His coat, expensive and pressed, hung heavy on his shoulders. In his hand, wrapped in brown paper and string, was a coil of thick rope. He carried it like a man with a plan he wasn't proud of, but had accepted. He did not come for the scenery or the autumn leaves, though they blanketed the ground like a memory. He came to walk through the echoes. The swings still creaked, the benches still bore carvings of initials, and the old oak tree near the pond stood as solid as it had 30 years ago, when Robert was a boy and still believed his father was a good man. William was in his 70s now, wealthy beyond need, but hollowed by grief. 6 months ago, he had buried his wife, Margaret. 3 years before that, he had lost Robert, his only son, in a car accident. At least that was what the death certificate said. The truth was murkier. They hadn't spoken in years. Robert had walked out after one final argument about legacy ambition and machines. William had always wanted him to inherit Holmes Technologies, the company he had built from nothing. But Robert wanted to restore cars, not empires, and William, in his arrogance, could not bend. That day, words were said that should not have been. Words that echoed louder now than any footsteps in the park. He stopped near the pond where the water was still and reflected the sky like glass. William sat on the cold bench. The rope sat beside him like a quiet promise. He remembered the toy car, a vintage red model of a 1960s Shelby Cobra. It had been Robert's favorite, a birthday gift when he turned 7. Robert used to carry it everywhere, racing it across tables and into corners, fixing imaginary engines with a screwdriver twice the size of the car. That toy had lived through scraped knees, summer vacations, and silent dinners. It had meant something. That morning, as William walked past the playground, he nearly didn't see the little girl, but the flash of red caught his eye. She stood near the gate, small, bundled in a hand-me-down coat, 2 sizes too big, holding the car like an offering. Her skin was dark, her hair pulled back into neat braids, and her eyes wide with a kind of tired determination. No sign, no pleading. Just the car extended in both hands like it was worth the world. William stopped. He stared. "Sir?" she asked, voice soft but firm. "Would you like to buy this car? It still works." William blinked. "Where did you get that?" "It was a gift," she said. "Long time ago. My mom is sick. We need money for medicine. I'm trying to help." He looked down at her hands. The car was scuffed, the paint faded in places, but it was unmistakable. That was Robert's car, not just the model, the very one. There was a scratch on the right side from when Robert had thrown it against a chair during a tantrum. William remembered yelling. He remembered Robert crying. He remembered apologizing too late. "What's your name?" William asked. "Nancy. Nancy Morrison." He swallowed. The name meant nothing to him, but the car, that meant everything. "How old are you, Nancy?" 8. His throat tightened. 8. Robert had been 8 when he built his first working go-kart out of scrap metal and a lawnmower engine. William had been proud. He had clapped him on the back and told him, "Now build something that matters." It was the wrong thing to say. Maybe the beginning of everything that went wrong. He took out his wallet and gave her a bill far larger than she asked for. Her eyes widened. "That's too much." "It's not," he said. "Come. Show me where you live." She hesitated, but something in his voice, or perhaps his eyes, heavy with sorrow and sincerity, made her nod. As they walked, passers-by glanced at them, some with curiosity, some with judgment. A black child and an old white man in a tailored coat didn't often walk side by side in this part of town. William noticed, and for the first time in a long while he cared. Nancy pointed to a small apartment building a few blocks away. The neighborhood was worn but clean, the kind of place that felt lived in and slightly forgotten by the city. Before they reached the door, William stopped. "Nancy, this car. Who gave it to you?" She looked up. "A man named Robert. He used to visit. He fixed stuff. He was nice. He said I could keep it." William's breath caught. He didn't speak. He followed her in the rope, still wrapped in paper, still in his pocket, but suddenly much heavier than before. He hadn't planned on living today, but something in that little girl's eyes in the worn toy car she offered the world for the price of medicine told him maybe there was more story left to tell. William followed Nancy through the uneven sidewalks of the neighborhood, the rope still bundled in his pocket, like a secret he hadn't yet decided what to do with. The closer they got to her building, the more his steps slowed, not out of hesitation, but from unfamiliarity. This wasn't a part of town he knew. His world had been one of boardroom chauffeurs, tailored suits, and doormen. Here, the paint peeled from old brick, the fences sagged, and the wind carried the smell of oil and old leaves. But there was something honest about it, something humble. Nancy skipped a little ahead now, clutching the bill he had given her like a treasure. Not out of greed, but out of purpose. She paused in front of a narrow apartment building with rusted mailboxes and worn steps. Without saying much, she led him up a flight of stairs that creaked under his weight. The apartment door opened to a room that was small but clean. The walls were aged, the carpet faded, yet everything had a place. There were only 2 rooms and a kitchenette with sunlight filtering through sheer curtains that had clearly been washed many times. The air smelled of herbal tea and menthol ointment. In the corner, a thin woman lay on a low cot, her eyes half-lidded, her skin ashen, but her posture proud. She turned her head slowly when she heard the door. Her expression shifted from concern to surprise when she saw the older man trailing behind her daughter. "Mom," Nancy said quietly but with pride, "this is Mr. Holmes. He bought the car." William nodded politely, removing his gloves. "Good afternoon. I didn't mean to intrude." Jane Morrison tried to sit up, wincing with effort. Her voice was soft, worn by sickness and years of hardship. "You're not intruding, sir. Any friend of Nancy's. Thank you for helping her." He could tell she was cautious. She didn't ask questions. She didn't show emotion, but her eyes scanned him, as if trying to place him or maybe protect her daughter from disappointment. William stepped closer, but kept his distance, not wanting to overwhelm. His instincts told him she was proud, not someone who often accepted charity. "I didn't just come to buy the car," he said. "I wanted to make sure she was safe." Jane offered a weak smile. "She's tougher than she looks." Nancy had already gone to the small kitchen and poured a glass of water, which she handed to her mother with the care of someone who had done it 100 times. The little girl moved around the apartment with familiarity and purpose, picking up stray things, straightening a crooked frame, adjusting a small blanket folded near the foot of the bed. William watched quietly. Everything felt different now. He wasn't a man rescuing a child. He was a stranger entering a life that already had its structure, its scars, its rhythm. He sat down on a worn armchair and placed the red toy car on the table beside him. It looked more fragile now than ever before. "I knew someone who had that same car," he said, almost to himself. Jane glanced at it, her expression flickering for just a second. "Robert gave it to Nancy years ago. He used to come by, fix the toaster, help with rent, bring groceries. He was a kind man." William didn't answer. His throat tightened. He felt the weight of it all. Robert's name spoken here in this place by this woman. He hadn't heard his son's name in any context outside grief and formality for years. That someone else had known him, cared for him, had seen a side of him that William had lost access to, it hit him harder than he expected. Nancy came over and sat on the arm of her mother's cot. Daddy Robert used to make the toaster pop out the bread real fast. He called it a racing toaster. William forced a smile, but his hands were trembling. He placed them flat on his knees, grounding himself. "Did he come often?" Jane nodded carefully, adjusting the blanket over her legs. "Every few weeks. Sometimes more. He never stayed long, but he never forgot us." There was a photograph on the shelf above the TV. William stood and walked toward it. In it, Robert was crouched beside Nancy, both of them, covered in what looked like paint or oil, laughing. Jane stood beside them, holding a wrench, smiling genuinely. It wasn't a photo taken for show. It was a memory captured midlife. Real. Honest. He stared at it for a long moment. "I didn't know he still worked with his hands." Jane's voice had an edge now, quiet but firm. "He did what made him feel whole. That's all anyone wants." William turned back toward her. He didn't argue. He couldn't. He remembered the shouting, the threats, the final words spoken between them. "You're wasting your life in garages," he had said once. "You're throwing away your future." Now, standing in this tiny room where his son had found meaning, William felt like the one who had wasted something. He sat down again, this time more slowly. "I'm sorry for asking this," he began gently, "but is Robert Nancy's father?" Jane's expression didn't change. She glanced at Nancy, who was now sitting on the floor, drawing something on the back of an envelope. He loved her like one, Jane said. "That's what matters most, isn't it?" William nodded, saying nothing. He wasn't sure he could speak. He didn't know if he felt relief, sadness, or guilt. Maybe all of them. Maybe none. Nancy looked up and smiled, unaware of the heaviness in the air. "He promised to take me to see a real race car one day, but then he stopped coming." Jane reached over and gently touched her daughter's hand. William noticed how her fingers shook slightly. The illness was deeper than she admitted. The shadows under her eyes, the hollow of her cheeks, they weren't from one bad week. They were from years of carrying weight alone. He cleared his throat and stood again. "What medicine do you need? I can go get it." Jane hesitated. "We're managing. I don't want to take advantage of—" "You're not." William's voice was firm but calm. "Let me help, please." Nancy followed him to the door, whispering, "It's the blue bottle from Walker's Pharmacy. They know." When William stepped out into the hallway, a woman across the hall stared at him. Her eyes scanned his suit, his face, and then flicked toward the door he had just exited. There was no greeting, just judgment. At the pharmacy, the cashier was polite but reserved with Nancy's order until William placed the money on the counter. Suddenly, the tone changed. Smiles appeared. Voices softened. It didn't go unnoticed. Back at the apartment, Jane was dozing lightly. Nancy let him in quietly and set the medicine on the kitchen counter. William stood by the window, looking out at the street below. The world kept moving cars, passing a dog, barking children, yelling somewhere beyond the buildings. But inside that room, something had shifted. Something small, but undeniable. He turned to Nancy. "I'd like to come back tomorrow. Would that be all right?" She nodded. "Mom likes you. She doesn't say it, but I can tell." William gave her a tired smile. "You're a very smart girl." Nancy tilted her head. "That's what Daddy Robert used to say." He looked at her, and for a brief second the air between them grew still. There were too many things unsaid, too many questions without answers. But there was also something else now, an opening, a beginning. That evening, when he returned to his mansion, the silence felt different, less permanent. He placed the red toy car on his desk and sat in the old leather chair, not to remember the past, but to understand it, to start perhaps again. The next few days passed slowly, but with a rhythm that felt strangely comforting. William found himself waking up with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He no longer lingered in bed, waiting for the weight of grief to pin him down. Instead, he would dress deliberately always in something simple and drive back to that modest apartment where a young girl and her mother had, without meaning to, stirred something long dormant in him. The first time he returned, he brought fresh bread and a small bag of groceries. Nancy opened the door with the ease of someone who was beginning to expect him. Her smile was quick, her energy always just a little too much for the narrow hallway they stood in. "Mom's awake today," she said, taking the bag from him with both hands as if it were made of gold. William stepped inside and was greeted by the faint sound of a kettle boiling and the soft voice of Jane humming a hymn under her breath. That afternoon, William fixed the flickering lamp on Jane's nightstand, though in truth it was Nancy who handed him the correct bulb, held the flashlight steady, and reminded him gently that twisting it too tight might break the socket. When the light blinked on properly for the first time in weeks, Nancy clapped like someone at a magic show. William laughed genuinely, not the polite chuckle he reserved for social functions, but a deep human laugh that surprised even him. It felt foreign and familiar all at once. Jane watched from the bed with a small smile, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The lines around her eyes were softer that day. Nancy was a child with a way of speaking that disarmed you. She said things with complete sincerity, as if every thought deserved to be shared. One morning, while they sat eating toast together, she looked up and said, "Did you know, Mr. Holmes, some people get lonely even when they live in big houses?" William blinked the toast halfway to his mouth. He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "Yes, they do." She chewed for a moment, then added, "I think your house is probably really quiet." William paused, then placed the toast down. "It is. Too quiet." And that was the end of it. She didn't push, didn't pry, but the truth of it lingered in the air like dust in a sunbeam. As the visits continued, so did the moments. Little ones. Moments that didn't seem important as they happened but settled into William's memory like small stones in a pocket. Nancy helping him fold laundry, Jane asking about his favorite books, William sitting silently by the window while Jane napped the radio playing soft jazz in the background. Yet with each passing day, a question began forming in William's mind. It started as a whisper and grew louder every time Nancy called Robert Daddy. She used the word casually, affectionately, with that wide-eyed honesty only children possess. At first, he thought it was just a way of honoring someone who had been kind. But then came the little comments about how Robert had helped her ride her bike, how he once promised to teach her how to change a tire, how he had tucked her in when she had a fever. These weren't just friendly gestures. These were the things a father did. William found himself staring longer at Nancy, watching for traces of Robert's face in hers, in the shape of her eyes, in the way she furrowed her brow when concentrating. One evening, William sat on the edge of his bed holding an old photo album. The pages were thick, the corners worn. He ran his fingers over a picture of Robert at age 7, grinning beside a red bicycle with training wheels. His son had that same tilt of the head, that same lopsided smile. William's heart pounded with a dull ache. Could it be? Could Robert have had a child and never told him? The timelines almost lined up. Nancy was 8. Robert had passed 3 years ago. It was possible. But Jane had never said anything directly, and William was too proud or perhaps too afraid to ask. Back at the apartment the next day, he tried to dance around the topic. Nancy, he said, watching her draw spaceships on an old envelope. You and Robert were very close, weren't you? She nodded. He fixed things. Mom's toaster. My bike. He even fixed the lamp until it broke again. She smiled. He said I was better at tools than most grown-ups. William nodded, a lump forming in his throat. Did he ever talk about your dad? Nancy tilted her head. You mean Daddy Robert? William hesitated. Yes, him. She shrugged. He was just always there. I don't remember anything before him. Mom says I was too small. Jane, sitting nearby, glanced up at that. Her face gave away nothing, but her hands paused in folding the laundry. William met her eyes, searching, but she turned away and changed the subject. That night during dinner, the silence between them grew heavier. Nancy chattered about school, about how she wanted to be an astronaut mechanic, a job she claimed she made up. But William and Jane barely spoke. He wanted to ask. He wanted to demand the truth. But something in her silence stopped him. Not out of shame, but out of a deeper kind of protection. William knew that silence well. He had used it himself many times to keep people out. Later, as Nancy brushed her teeth, William and Jane stood by the window. The streetlights outside flickered. William spoke first. She says Robert was like a father to her. Jane nodded slowly. He was. In every way that mattered. William turned to her. But was he? She didn't answer right away. Her gaze remained fixed on something far beyond the glass. He loved her, she said finally. That's what I can tell you. That night, William drove home in silence. The car felt too large, the road too empty. He parked outside his house and sat in the dark for a while. He didn't go in. Instead, he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small envelope, a photo Nancy had drawn for him earlier that week. It showed him, her, and Jane all holding hands in front of a crooked little house. Above them, a sun with a smiling face beamed down. William stared at it, his throat tight. He wasn't sure what he was feeling, only that he hadn't felt it in a very long time. Inside the mansion, he went to his study and opened an old drawer. Inside were several letters from Robert, none recent, all formal, polite, stiff. Letters that never mentioned love or connection or purpose. William realized now just how little he had known of the man his son had become. He sat down and placed Nancy's drawing beside one of Robert's letters. Side by side, they told two very different stories, one cold and distant, the other warm and full of life. And somewhere between them, William began to understand that the past could not be rewritten, but the future, perhaps, still had pages left to fill. He stared at the red toy car resting on his shelf, the paint chipped, the wheels loose, but it was still standing, like Nancy, like Jane, like himself maybe. He didn't know what came next, but for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid to find out. William had always considered himself a man of reason, someone who could weigh facts and draw conclusions without letting emotion cloud his judgment. But now, everything he thought he knew about his son, about fatherhood, about himself, was quietly coming undone piece by piece. He had tried for days to push the thought aside to accept what he saw in front of him without needing an explanation. But something inside him refused to settle. He needed to know, not because he doubted Nancy's worth, but because he had never truly understood who his son had become in the final years of his life. That evening, after helping Nancy with her spelling homework and tucking her into bed, William stood quietly in the hallway for a long moment, then turned to Jane, who sat curled on the old living room couch, a cup of tea in her hands that had long gone cold. He walked over slowly, his posture not as rigid as before, but careful, uncertain. He sat down across from her, cleared his throat once, then spoke his voice low. "Jane, I hope you know I've never wanted to intrude, but I need to ask you something, and I ask because it matters to me more than I expected it would." Jane looked up at him, her eyes tired but alert. She said nothing, only nodded once. William continued, "Was Robert Nancy's biological father?" The question hung in the room like a pause in a long piece of music, not jarring but unmistakably weighty. Jane's fingers tightened slightly around the teacup, and she looked away for a second as if weighing something deeply personal. Then she set the cup down, rested her hands on her knees, and finally met his eyes. "No," she said softly, "he wasn't. Not by blood." William didn't speak. His hands rested in his lap, motionless. Jane continued, her voice steady, though every word clearly cost her something to say. "Nancy's father was a man named Arlo Morrison. He was my partner. He was also the man who saved Robert's life in a car accident while Robert was studying overseas. Arlo didn't make it. I was 6 months pregnant at the time." William closed his eyes briefly, exhaling as if trying to exorcise years of ignorance. He had never heard this story, not even a hint of it. "He saved Robert?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. Jane nodded. "Robert never forgot. He visited me, checked in, offered help. At first, I thought it was just out of guilt or gratitude, but over time, it turned into something else. He became our family. He was there when Nancy was born. He was the one who brought me home from the hospital. He fixed our leaking roof, helped with groceries, taught Nancy how to tie her shoes. She started calling him Daddy, and he never corrected her." Her voice trembled now, eyes shining. "And then, one day, he said he was going to visit his parents, said he needed to make peace. He smiled, hugged Nancy, kissed my forehead, and then he just never came back. No call, no letter, nothing. I thought maybe he changed his mind. Maybe he thought we were too much." Jane wiped her cheek, ashamed. William's throat tightened. His heart pounded as he finally opened the truth he had buried. "Jane," he said, his voice cracking, "Robert didn't leave. He didn't abandon you. He died that same day. He never made it to our house. There was an accident on the interstate, a pileup. His car was found hours later. I got the call from the police. We buried him thinking he died on his way home. I didn't know where he'd been before. I thought he didn't want to talk to me anymore." Jane gasped, her hands covering her mouth. "He died that day. Oh God, all these years." Her body shook as quiet sobs took over. William reached for her hand, something paternal and desperate in the gesture. "I didn't know what he meant to you," he whispered. "I didn't know he had someone, that he was happy." Jane tried to breathe steadily. He was more than happy. He found purpose. He loved Nancy like his own. He told her stories every night. He built her toys from scratch. When I was too tired to cook, he'd show up with food. He didn't have to stay, but he did. Every time. William looked around the room as if trying to see the echoes of his son. "And he never told me. I thought we had nothing left between us, but he was becoming the man I always wanted him to be. Just not in the way I imagined." Jane nodded. "Because you wanted him to be someone else, but he was already whole William. He was kind. He was present. He forgave quickly. Nancy carries that in her." They sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, the sound of distant traffic drifted through the cracked window, mixed with the faint ticking of the wall clock. William finally stood and walked toward the bedroom where Nancy slept, the door slightly ajar. He peeked in. The little girl was curled under a thin blanket, her arm wrapped around the red toy car. Her breathing was even peaceful. William's heart ached, not out of confusion anymore, but something deeper. He had missed out on so much, not just with his son, but with this new life his son had helped create and protect. He returned to the living room. Jane was still there, her eyes moist but calm. "Jane," he said gently, "thank you for telling me." She nodded. "I thought you had a right to know, but I also didn't want to give you another reason to leave." "I'm not leaving," William said without hesitation. "Not anymore." The following morning, William arrived earlier than usual, holding a bag of freshly baked bread and a small bouquet of yellow flowers. Jane looked surprised but smiled warmly. Nancy, already dressed for school, grabbed his hand excitedly and dragged him to the kitchen to show a drawing she had made, a picture of her Jane, Robert, and William all standing together with a banner above that read, "My Family." William's throat caught again, but this time it was joy, not sorrow, that filled him. Later, as Jane and William sat on the front steps watching Nancy play hopscotch with sidewalk chalk, Jane turned to him. "She's resilient," she said, "stronger than I ever was at that age." "She gets that from you," William replied. Then, after a pause, he added, "And from Robert." Jane nodded. He would have been proud to see her now, to see all of this. William looked at the street, at the chalk lines Nancy had drawn, crooked but bright. "I think he'd be proud of us too." For the first time in a long time, William didn't feel lost in the past. He didn't feel shackled by regret. He felt present. He felt part of something real, something earned, not inherited. And as the sun rose higher, casting warm light over the sidewalk, the porch, and the small family in its glow, he allowed himself to believe in the possibility of redemption, not through penance or punishment, but through presence, through staying, through love, however unexpected its arrival had been. And in that quiet morning light, as Nancy laughed and chalk dust floated in the air like confetti, William Holmes smiled, not the smile of a man who had won something, but the smile of a man who had finally come home. The next morning, William arrived with a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. The front door to Jane's apartment was still shut, the morning air carried a cool bite, and the sun hung low, but clear. In his arms, he carried a brown paper bag filled with fresh bread from a small bakery on 6th Street, the kind Robert used to like, and a modest bouquet of yellow chrysanthemums. He hadn't bought flowers in years, not since Margaret's funeral, but this felt different. This wasn't a gesture of grief. It was one of intent. Jane opened the door, looking surprised to see him so early. Her hair was still damp from a morning shower, and she wore a sweater, a size too large, one sleeve casually rolled up. "Good morning," she said softly, not quite sure how to greet a man who'd once been a stranger, now walking into their lives with the quiet presence of someone who belonged. "Good morning," William replied, lifting the bag. "I brought breakfast. Thought Nancy might enjoy something warm before school." Jane stepped aside, a faint smile forming. "She's still brushing her teeth. Come in." They sat at the tiny kitchen table, the bread cut buttered and steaming on a chipped ceramic plate. Nancy ran in moments later, ponytail crooked and shoelaces untied, and beamed when she saw William. "You came back," she said, wrapping her arms around his waist with an ease that startled him. Startled him, not because she did it, but because of how natural it felt to receive it. "I told you I would," he said, smoothing her hair. During the meal, Nancy chattered about a school assignment drawing a family tree. She described her sketch, how she'd drawn Robert at the top, Jane on one side, herself in the middle, and now William. "I didn't know what to call you," she said, eyes earnest, "so I wrote Grandpa Will. Is that okay?" William stared at the slice of bread in his hand, throat catching, but he nodded slowly. "It's more than okay," he said. "It's perfect." Jane glanced at him from across the table, something softening behind her eyes. For a long time she'd lived cautiously, never sure who would stay, who might hurt her family. But here he was, not performing, not proving, just present. Later that afternoon, William suggested they visit a doctor. "Not a clinic this time," he added. "I have a physician I trust. Private, discreet. You deserve the best care, Jane." She hesitated. "I don't want to owe you anything." He met her gaze, calm and steady. "You won't. This isn't a transaction. It's a promise. I failed Robert in many ways, but I'm not going to fail the people he loved." The appointment was scheduled for the next morning. William arranged for Nancy to stay with a neighbor, though the little girl wasn't thrilled. "Only if you pinky swear you'll come back," she said, holding up her tiny finger. William linked his with hers and said, "Cross my heart." At the clinic, Jane underwent a full exam. William waited in the lobby, legs crossed, phone untouched. When the doctor finally emerged, his expression was serious, but not grim. "She's stable," he said. "We need a proper treatment plan, but it's manageable with care." William exhaled as if releasing a breath he'd held for years. That evening, back at the apartment, Jane sat on the couch, a blanket over her lap, watching Nancy draw on the floor. William returned from the pharmacy with the prescribed medication and a new toothbrush for Nancy, because hers looked frayed. He also brought a book about car mechanics for kids. Figured it might be something Robert would have picked, he said. Jane looked up at him. He would have. He always found ways to connect with her. William sat down beside her. I never asked him what made him happy. I just assumed success meant what I defined it to be. Jane's eyes were kind but honest. You're asking now. That counts for something. That weekend, William took Nancy to a small hardware store on the corner. She had mentioned wanting to build a birdhouse for school. Together, they picked out wood nails, paint, and a tiny hammer. The store clerk gave them a strange look. An older white man with a black child and a stiff suit-wearing presence, but William didn't flinch. Nancy didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she'd grown used to it. Back home, they worked on the birdhouse on the fire escape. William showed her how to measure, steady her hand with the hammer, and let her pick the color. Can it be red like the car, she asked? He smiled. It should be. Later that evening, Jane joined them, standing at the doorway with a warm, tired smile. You two look like professionals. We're engineers now, Nancy declared. Grandpa says it's in my blood. Jane chuckled softly. William looked at her, then at Nancy, then at the birdhouse. Maybe it is. That night, they had dinner together, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. Jane cooked, William set the table. Nancy folded napkins into what she called fancy triangles. It was the first meal that felt like a home. No announcements, no speeches, just clinking plates, laughter, the smell of rosemary and garlic. After dinner, Nancy placed the red toy car on a high shelf in the living room, so Daddy can see everything she said matter-of-factly. William froze for a beat, watching the small car gleam in the dim light. He didn't cry. Instead, he placed his hand gently on her back. He'd be proud, he whispered. And when it was time for bed, Nancy asked William to read to her. Jane stood by the doorway, arms crossed, a quiet witness to something sacred. William opened the book one Robert used to love and read slowly, voice slightly hoarse but steady. Nancy's eyes fluttered closed halfway through. Jane whispered, "She's asleep." William nodded, closed the book, and pulled the blanket over Nancy's small frame. They stood there for a moment longer. Then Jane said, "I never imagined this, that someone like you would be here, not out of duty, just here." He looked at her more human than he'd ever felt. Neither did I. In the quiet that followed, something unspoken was mended, not forgotten, but forgiven. And as they turned off the lights and closed the door behind them, the apartment didn't feel quite so small. It felt full in the way a heart can be full even after it's been broken. And in that fullness, William knew he wasn't just rebuilding a family. He was becoming part of one. The next week began like any other. Mornings were quiet but full, Nancy rushing to brush her teeth before school, William packing her lunch with more care than he ever used on corporate memos, Jane sitting on the couch with a throw blanket over her knees, sipping tea still frail but smiling more each day. But on Wednesday morning, something changed. Jane had risen early, insisting on helping fold laundry. William had told her to rest, but she waved him off, walking slowly toward the basket by the bedroom. She bent over, reached for a towel, and suddenly went still. Her hand trembled. She stood up halfway, lost her balance, and crumpled to the floor. William heard the sound from the kitchen, a soft thud followed by silence. When he reached the bedroom, Jane was on her side. Eyes wide open, lips parted, breathing short and shallow. Jane, he dropped to his knees. She tried to speak, to wave him off again, but this time her strength gave out. Nancy stood in the hallway, eyes wide, gripping the red toy car like it might save her mother. William scooped Jane into his arms, his voice trembling but firm as he told Nancy to grab her coat. They were in the car within minutes, racing through light traffic toward St. Bartholomew's. Jane faded in and out in the back seat, her head resting on William's coat. At the emergency room, the air was sterile and humming, filled with beeping monitors and whispers. William explained everything to the admitting nurse with a calmness he didn't feel gripping the edge of the reception counter until his knuckles blanched. Nancy sat silently in one of the hard blue chairs, her small hands tucked beneath her legs, her feet not touching the floor. She didn't cry, not at first. She just stared ahead. William sat beside her, touching her back gently, letting the silence speak, until she finally whispered, "She's gonna be okay." Right. He wanted to say yes, but he wouldn't lie to her. Not now. Not ever. "She's getting the best help we can give her," he said, "and we're staying right here." Jane was admitted for further tests. The doctor, a tall man with glasses and a clipped tone, came out with a chart in his hand and a practiced look of concern. "She's suffering from complications tied to chronic pulmonary issues. Some of this likely developed over time: stress, poor diet, lack of consistent care. It's serious but manageable with hospitalization and long-term treatment. She needs rest, proper medication, and steady support. William nodded, already knowing the answer, before asking, "How long will she be here?" "At least a week, maybe more. We'll know better once we monitor her response to the medication." Nancy finally began to cry that night. In the hallway outside Jane's room, where she wasn't allowed to go past visiting hours, she pressed her forehead to William's chest and sobbed without words. He knelt down, wrapping both arms around her, feeling the thrum of her panic like a second heartbeat. "I don't want her to go too," she whispered, voice barely audible. William closed his eyes. He remembered Robert's final trip, remembered Margaret's quiet last night at home. Too many goodbyes that came too soon. "She's strong," he said softly. "We're going to help her fight." He carried Nancy back to the car, her arms looped around his neck, her toy car pressed between them. They drove home in silence. The apartment felt colder that night. William let Nancy sleep in the bed with him, something she didn't even ask for. In the dark, she whispered again. "Do you think she's scared?" "I know she is," he replied. "But she knows we're here. That makes a difference." The next day, William visited Jane while Nancy was at school. Jane's face was pale against the white sheets, but her eyes focused when he walked in. "You came back," she said hoarsely. "Of course I did." She tried to sit up but winced. "Nancy, she's okay. She cried herself to sleep last night, but she's okay." Jane's voice cracked. "She needs someone. I always told myself I could protect her. But what if I can't?" "You did," he said. "You have. And now you don't have to do it alone." Her eyes filled and she turned her face toward the window. "I was so mad at Robert when he disappeared. I thought he'd just abandoned us. It made me so angry. But now, knowing what happened, knowing he died coming home," she stopped, voice catching. "I feel like I owe him. For everything." William reached for her hand. "Then let's honor him by taking care of each other." Later that afternoon, William sat with Nancy in the hospital cafeteria. She barely touched her sandwich. A nurse walked by and gave them a second glance, an older white man in a tailored coat, sitting with a young black girl, her face drawn and quiet. There was a flicker of judgment in the nurse's eyes, not overt, but there. A pause, a hesitation. William met her look directly, not with anger, but with a firm kind of presence. He slid his chair closer to Nancy and said loud enough for the nurse to hear, "Let's take some cookies back to your mom. She loves oatmeal, right?" Nancy smiled faintly. "She always picks the ones with raisins." They returned to Jane's room before sunset. William adjusted the blinds while Nancy sat beside her mother's bed holding her hand. "I made a card," she said, pulling a folded piece of notebook paper from her pocket. It was a crayon drawing of the three of them, Jane, Nancy, and William, standing outside their apartment, the red toy car on the windowsill behind them. "That's our family," she said shyly. Jane looked at the drawing, then at William. Her lips trembled. "She really thinks of you as family." William didn't blink. "I do too." That night, alone in the apartment, William sat in the armchair by the window, the city noise faint outside. He looked at the photo of Robert on the mantel next to a new frame Nancy had made out of popsicle sticks. Inside it was her card, carefully flattened and pressed between glass. The quiet was no longer hollow. It was full of presence of people worth fighting for, of love that asked nothing in return. And in that moment, William knew, even in the face of uncertainty, this was the family he chose. And he would fight for them, no matter what storms still lay ahead. The week after Jane's return from the hospital was meant to be a quiet one. William had cleared his calendar entirely, allowing no interruptions from the outside world. Their small apartment had settled into a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Early breakfasts with oatmeal and fruit, late afternoon walks for fresh air, and evenings filled with old jazz records playing low in the background. But peace, as William had learned throughout his life, was a fragile thing. It could break without warning, often from the most unexpected corners. On Saturday evening, William hosted a modest dinner. It was partly to celebrate Jane's homecoming, and partly perhaps to reassure those from his old world that he was well, despite recent personal transformations that had unsettled more than a few. The guest list was short former colleagues, old friends, from the club neighbors, from the building's upper floors. Most were white, well-dressed, and wore smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Nancy helped set the table with childish enthusiasm, carefully aligning forks and folding napkins the way Margaret had once taught Robert. Jane, still weak but stubbornly self-sufficient, prepared a simple chicken casserole and insisted on arranging a vase of fresh daisies. The doorbell rang at 6. As guests filtered in, they exchanged pleasantries, patted William on the back, and offered soft remarks about the food or decor. But their eyes, trained calculating, drifted repeatedly toward Nancy and Jane. One woman, elegantly dressed in a navy silk blouse, leaned toward William during appetizers and asked with a smile too thin to be warm, "Is she your granddaughter?" Her voice lowered. "She doesn't look like you." William stiffened, placing his wine glass down slowly. "She's my family," he said simply. The woman blinked, her smile freezing in place. "Of course," she replied, turning back to her plate. Later, as dessert was being served, apple crumble, Nancy's favorite, another guest, a man William once served on a foundation board with, muttered, "Must be tough, taking in someone like that." He gestured subtly toward Nancy. Jane, overhearing from the kitchen, stopped mid-step, her hands tightening around the dish towel. She had spent years enduring microaggressions that came laced with courtesy. But this stung more than usual, not because it was new, but because it was aimed at her child. In the living room, Nancy sat cross-legged on the floor, coloring in a notebook, her small body quiet but alert. She heard the tone, even if she didn't grasp every word. Later that night, when the guests had left and the apartment smelled faintly of perfume and cinnamon, she asked William while brushing her teeth, "Do they think I don't belong?" William paused. The question asked so innocently cut deep. He kneeled beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Some people have trouble seeing what matters," he said, "but I see you, and I choose you, every day." That night, Jane confronted William in the kitchen. Her voice was even, but there was steel underneath. "They treated us like charity, like we're here because you're feeling guilty." William didn't flinch. He rinsed a plate and set it in the rack before turning to face her. "That's not what this is." "I know," she said, "but they don't. And maybe you need to say it, out loud, to them, to the world." The next week, Nancy was scheduled to perform at her school's winter concert. Jane, still recovering, insisted she could attend with help, and William arranged a car and seats near the aisle. The auditorium was crowded, filled with parents and faculty. William wore a navy blazer. Jane held a bouquet of grocery store flowers. Nancy stood in the second row, beaming, her red headband matching the bow on her dress. She sang with heart, her voice clear and bright. But during the reception, an older teacher leaned in and said to William, "She's yours." Her eyes narrowed slightly. Adopted William breathed in through his nose. "She's mine," he said. "Not adopted, chosen." He didn't smile, didn't soften it. The woman looked taken aback. Jane, watching from a few feet away, gave a subtle nod of approval. Nancy skipped over moments later, unaware of the exchange. "Did you hear me?" she asked breathlessly. Every word William said. "You were wonderful." That night, while Jane lay resting and Nancy colored at the coffee table, William sat by the window, phone in hand. He wrote a post for the foundation newsletter he still contributed to. He spoke plainly about love that transcends bloodlines, about racism that still lingers in respectable homes, and polite dinners, about how family is what you choose to fight for. He didn't name names. He didn't need to. The message was clear. When he hit send, he felt no hesitation. The responses came quickly. Some were supportive, filled with words like brave and honorable. Others were less kind, questioning his judgment, accusing him of being manipulated or senile. One old acquaintance wrote, "This isn't who you used to be." William replied, "Maybe not, but this is who I am now." The next weekend, they went to the park, the same park where William had once wandered with a coil of rope in his pocket, weighed down by grief and guilt. Now he sat on a bench watching Nancy race across the grass, her laugh echoing in the crisp air. Jane sat beside him, wrapped in a shawl. "They're going to keep looking at us funny," she said softly. "Let them look," William replied. "We're not hiding." Nancy came running up, cheeks flushed. "I won the race," she declared. William high-fived her. "Of course you did." Jane watched them, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she whispered. William looked at her, then at Nancy. "Neither did I." And so even as the world around them whispered doubts, even as subtle glances and pointed comments tried to fracture what they had built, they stood firm. Not because they had something to prove, but because they had someone to protect. And that was more than enough. The weeks following Jane's return home brought a fragile peace to their small makeshift family. Nancy was doing better in school, her drawings more colorful, her laughter more frequent. Jane's health was slowly stabilizing, though she moved with cautious effort, always carrying the weariness of someone who had faced too much for too long. William, despite his age, felt a strange kind of renewal in their presence. For the first time in years, his mornings began with purpose, not silence. But peace rarely lasts. It began with a letter. Thick paper, expensive envelope, the embossed emblem of a law firm William had used decades ago. He sat alone at the kitchen table, eyes narrowing as he unfolded the contents. The words struck like cold water. His niece and her husband, the children of his younger sister, were contesting his recent changes to his will and his intent to name Nancy as a beneficiary. They had filed a request for a mental health evaluation, suggesting that William's decision-making might be compromised due to grief and age. Buried between the legal jargon were thinly veiled accusations that Jane was manipulating him, that Nancy was not really family, that the Holmes estate was at risk of falling into the hands of outsiders. William's hand trembled slightly as he folded the letter back into the envelope. He didn't immediately tell Jane or Nancy. Instead, he took a long walk around the block through the leaf-strewn sidewalks past neighbors he barely recognized anymore. He needed to breathe to calm the storm brewing in his chest. He hadn't expected this, not from his own blood. When he finally broke the news that evening, Jane was sitting on the couch folding laundry and Nancy was coloring at the coffee table. "They want to take you away." He said the words dry and heavy. Jane looked up, her eyes sharpening with worry. "What do you mean?" He handed her the letter. Her fingers trembled as she read, her lips pressed into a tight line. "This is because of me," she whispered. "They think I'm—" "No." William cut in firm. "This is because they never learned what family really means." Nancy watched silently, sensing the shift in the room. Her crayon stopped moving. "Did I do something wrong?" Jane rushed to her, kneeling to hug her tightly. "No, baby, never. This isn't your fault." William sat beside them, rubbing his forehead. "We'll fight it. I won't let them take anything from us. Not again." But the stress settled into the walls of the apartment like mold. Jane began losing sleep. Nancy became quiet, more withdrawn. At school, she got into a small altercation when another student said something cruel about her family. William, meanwhile, was on the phone daily with lawyers gathering documentation, letters of support from doctors and community members. 2 weeks later, they were summoned for a court hearing. Not a full trial yet, but a preliminary session to assess whether William's capacity should be questioned and whether temporary guardianship should be reassigned. The courtroom was a sterile space, all beige walls and buzzing lights. William wore his best suit. Jane held Nancy's hand tightly as they entered. On the other side of the room sat William's niece and her husband, both dressed sharply, flanked by 2 attorneys. The expressions on their faces were cold rehearsed. The judge was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a neutral tone. She began with formalities, then allowed each side to speak. William's lawyer began with calm authority. He presented William's long history of philanthropy, his recent physical and mental evaluations, and the character references attesting to his clarity and compassion. The opposing side countered with claims that William was emotionally compromised after losing both his wife and son, and that his actions, while perhaps well-intentioned, could be financially irresponsible. Jane was called to speak. Her voice was steady at first, then shook as she described the early years raising Nancy alone, the way Robert had helped them, the pain of losing him without answers. She didn't ask for pity, only fairness. Nancy was brought forward last. The judge knelt slightly so their eyes could meet. "Do you understand why you're here today, sweetheart?" Nancy nodded. "Because some people think I don't belong with William." "And how do you feel about living with him?" Nancy paused, then looked toward William. "He listens to me. He reads to me. He makes pancakes with faces on them. When I'm scared, he doesn't tell me to be quiet. He hugs me, and he never calls me a burden. Not once." The courtroom fell silent. The judge leaned back slowly. "Thank you, Nancy. That was very brave." No verdict was given that day, but temporary custody remained with William while the investigation continued. Outside the courthouse, William sat on the steps in the afternoon sun. Jane beside him, Nancy asleep in her lap. "They'll keep coming," Jane said softly. "They won't stop until they win or until you give up." William looked at her, then at Nancy. "Then I won't give them the satisfaction." He exhaled deeply. The battle was not over, but neither was his resolve. The house was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as if all the sound had been sucked out of it by the strain of the past few days. After the emotional toll of the courtroom, the ride home had been nearly silent. Jane sat in the passenger seat of William's car, her face turned to the window, the city lights casting flickers of gold and shadow on her cheeks. Nancy clutched William's hand in the back seat, but didn't say a word. William glanced at the rearview mirror several times during the drive, his knuckles white around the steering wheel, but he never spoke. There were no words left in him. Not yet. Later that night, after Jane had gone to bed early and William had retreated to the study with a glass of water he hardly touched, a sudden cry echoed through the house. High-pitched, panicked, unmistakably Nancy. William rushed down the hall faster than his knees approved of finding the little girl tangled in her bedsheets, face drenched in tears, shaking. "I dreamed they took me away," she sobbed. "I was screaming, but you couldn't hear me. You just kept walking." William dropped to his knees beside her bed and wrapped his arms around her. He held her tightly with a firmness that didn't ask permission and said through a trembling voice, "No one's taking you from me. You're where you belong." Her tiny hands clung to the fabric of his shirt like a child clinging to the edge of the world. He felt her heartbeat slow under his touch. William stayed there until she drifted off again, one hand in his, the other clutching the corner of the blanket like it was a lifeline. The next morning, Jane emerged from her bedroom looking tired but lighter, as though some unspoken burden had loosened its grip. Over a quiet breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast, she looked across the table and spoke plainly, her voice thick with vulnerability. "I always thought people like you," she said softly, eyes fixed on the rim of her coffee mug, "don't keep people like me around for long." William didn't pretend not to understand. The implication was clear. Jane had lived her life on the outer edge of security, never quite trusting a warm home, a gentle hand, or a man's promise. But here she was daring to speak it aloud. "I didn't know how to love my own son," William said after a long pause. "I loved him the way I thought a father should, with rules, expectations, legacy, but I never stopped to ask what he needed. Maybe if I had, he'd still be—" His voice broke, and Jane reached across the table, her hand brushing his. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. It was something more honest. It was understanding. That afternoon, while folding laundry with Nancy in the living room, William found himself telling her about Robert, about the way he used to take things apart, just to see how they worked, about how he could fix anything except the one thing that mattered, his relationship with his father. Nancy listened wide-eyed, sometimes asking simple questions that cut deeper than complicated ones. Did he like cartoons? He did when he was your age, especially the ones with cars that could talk. Then maybe he would have liked me too. William's heart caught in his throat. He didn't answer, just smiled gently and reached over to fix a crooked bow in her hair. That evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, painting the sky with quiet fire, Nancy walked into the room, holding the red toy car, the one that had started it all. She held it out to William with both hands, solemnly, like it was more than a toy. "You gave this to my daddy. He gave it to me. Now I want to give it to you, so we're all a family." William stared at the car, unable to speak. His fingers trembled as he took it from her, his eyes blurring with tears that refused to be held back. In that moment, the weight of everything, the missed birthdays, the cruel silences, the loss, collapsed into something redemptive. The next few days unfolded gently. There was laughter in the house again. Jane's laughter, once rare and cautious, began to surface more freely. William started cooking breakfast each morning, sometimes burning the toast, which Nancy found hilarious. They played board games, argued about whether the dog on the game card was actually a cat, and watched old movies on the couch under the same blanket. Nothing extraordinary happened, but everything changed. Jane, once frail and cautious, seemed to glow with a renewed strength. Her voice carried more weight. She took walks outside, short ones, but with purpose. She started painting again, her small sketches of trees and rooftops pinned around the living room like declarations of life. One afternoon, as the three of them were reorganizing the apartment's cluttered bookshelf, Nancy looked up and asked, "Do I have to call you Mr. Holmes forever?" William blinked, surprised. "Well, what would you like to call me?" Nancy tilted her head, thoughtful. Then she smiled. "Grandpa, if that's okay." He didn't answer right away. His throat closed again like it had a dozen times these past few weeks, but this time it wasn't from pain. It was from something gentler, Something healing. Yeah, he said, clearing his throat. That'd be more than okay. As Nancy skipped away, humming to herself, Jane stood beside William, both of them, watching the little girl move through the apartment like sunlight shifting through old curtains. Jane leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the first time since Robert's death, William felt something that had eluded him for years. Peace. They had not erased the past. They had not rewritten the story. But somehow, together, they had found a new chapter worth living. And it began quietly with a child's offer of love wrapped in a red toy car. The morning of the final hearing dawned colder than usual, but not just because of the weather. The courthouse loomed over the quiet street like a monument to everything William Holmes used to despise: rigid rules, impersonal decisions, the very bureaucracy that had once been nothing more than tools in his business empire. But this time he wasn't walking into that building as a CEO. He was walking in as something far more fragile yet more powerful, a man trying to hold on to the only family he had left. The courtroom was modest, but the atmosphere was anything but. Nancy sat next to Jane, her little hands clutched tightly in her lap. She wore a dark blue dress William had bought her for the occasion, with a small silver clip holding her curls away from her face. She didn't understand the law or the process, but she understood this much. Today people would decide whether she could stay with the man she now called Grandpa. William adjusted his tie nervously. His lawyer, a woman named Meredith Porter, leaned in and whispered calmly, "We've done everything right. Stay honest, stay steady. Let them see who you are." He nodded, but his heart was pounding. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't leverage. This was about love, pure and simple, and that made it far more terrifying. When the judge entered, all rose. The proceedings began with a factual review: Nancy's guardianship status, the history of Jane's health, the tragic passing of Robert Holmes. Then came testimony. Jane spoke first, her voice clear despite the fatigue still lingering in her bones. She told the court how William had appeared in their lives when they were desperate, how he had helped without question, how he had never once treated Nancy as anything other than his own. Then it was William's turn. He stood slowly, buttoning his coat, as if bracing himself against a cold wind. His voice, when it came, was steady, but thick with sincerity. "I spent my life building an empire, chasing something I thought mattered. I lost my son because I didn't know how to listen. I didn't understand his heart. I do now. And this girl," he turned toward Nancy, who looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. "This girl reminds me every day of what I should have fought for all along. I don't want to replace Robert. I just want to love Nancy the way he would have wanted her to be loved." There were murmurs in the room, even a few stifled sniffles. Nancy smiled, then climbed down from her seat and ran to William. "Grandpa," she whispered, wrapping her arms around his waist. The judge didn't stop her. He let the moment breathe. After a brief recess, the judge returned with his decision. In the matter of guardianship, he said, his voice solemn but not cold, "This court recognizes that family is not always defined by blood, but by consistent care, emotional commitment, and the best interest of the child. Mr. William Holmes is hereby granted full guardianship of Nancy Morrison." Jane burst into tears, not of sorrow, but of relief. Nancy squealed softly and clung tighter to William. Even Meredith Porter, usually unshakable, wiped at her eye before packing her briefcase. That evening, back at the modest apartment where Jane and Nancy lived, William sat in the small kitchen, a cup of tea cooling in his hands. Jane stood at the stove stirring soup. There was more peace in that cramped kitchen than in any boardroom he'd ever commanded. "I thought it would feel like a battle won," he said finally, watching Nancy draw at the table. "But it doesn't. It feels like I've finally come home." Jane turned her expression soft. "Robert would have wanted this. For all of us. You know that, right?" William nodded. "I didn't understand him, Jane. Not the way I should have. He was right to walk his own path. I wish I'd told him that." "He knew," Jane said simply. "He told me you loved him even when he was angry. He said he hoped you'd be proud of the man he became." William swallowed hard. He couldn't speak. Later that week, they moved into a new place, nothing extravagant, just a warm home with a small backyard and a workshop space for Nancy's tinkering. William had bought her a tiny tool set, and every Saturday morning they'd take apart and rebuild old gadgets together. One evening, Nancy found the little red toy car William had kept all these months carefully displayed on a shelf in his study. She walked over, picked it up, and studied it. "This was Robert's right?" she asked. "Yes," William said, walking over. "He loved that car. Said he'd fix up the real thing one day." Nancy smiled. "Maybe I can do it. For him. For you." William crouched beside her, taking the toy gently in his hand. "We'll do it together." And they would. Not just rebuild a car, but a sense of family, of purpose, of joy. The past could never be erased, but it didn't need to be. It had led them here. In the quiet of that night, William stood by a framed photo of Margaret on the mantel. He lit a candle and whispered, "You'd have loved her, Maggie. She's everything we needed and didn't know to ask for." Behind him, Nancy's laughter rang out from the living room. Jane joined in, and for the first time in many years, the house wasn't silent. It was alive. Spring settled gently over the city like a quiet apology after a long, punishing winter. It didn't arrive in loud declarations or fireworks, but in the simple unfolding of dogwood blossoms, in the soft warmth of sun-touching skin, and in the kind of stillness that made people breathe slower. William Holmes found himself once again walking through the same park, where months ago he had stood holding a rope with no intention of ever needing it again. But this time, he wasn't alone. Nancy ran a few steps ahead of him, her laughter rising in bursts like the birds around them. She held a small kite in one hand, its tail fluttering behind her, and every so often she turned around to shout back, "You're not running fast enough, Grandpa." He chuckled, winded hands on his hips. "That's because I'm 72, and you have the legs of a gazelle." Nancy giggled and slowed down, waiting for him with the kite lowered. They stood together on a small hill, the same hill where he first saw her selling a red toy car. That car now sat in a glass display case in his study, beside a photo of Robert and another of Margaret. In many ways, that moment had been the true turning point of his life. Not the courtroom victory, not the diagnosis reversal, not even Jane's recovery. It was that tiny hand holding out a forgotten toy, and eyes too big and too brave for such a small girl. As they caught their breath, Jane appeared from the path below, a basket in hand, wearing a straw hat that Nancy had insisted she buy. The woman had regained much of her strength. Her walk was confident, though still gentle, and her eyes, though marked by fatigue, now held peace where grief had once settled like mold in the corners. She had gained weight color and a little bit of laughter, too. Jane nodded toward a tree near the bench where William had once sat alone and motioned, "Let's have lunch here. Nancy, help me with the blanket." They spread out a tartan cloth and unpacked sandwiches, fruit, and cookies that Nancy had helped prepare the night before. The meal was simple, but rich with meaning. William bit into a turkey sandwich and looked over at the two people who had become his family, not by blood, but by choice, by presence, by shared wounds and healing. Nancy sat cross-legged, holding half a cookie and watching an ant try to drag a crumb the size of its own body. "Mom," she said suddenly, "do you think Daddy Robert can see us from heaven?" Jane froze for a second, her eyes searching William's. He swallowed slowly and answered before she could. "If he can, I think he's proud. Very proud. Not just of you, little one, but of your mom. And maybe even a little of me." "He would be," Jane added softly, brushing a crumb from Nancy's cheek. "He never stopped caring. Not for a second." William let the quiet linger. Then, after a beat, he looked at Jane with a more serious tone. "I keep thinking about what Margaret would say if she were here now." Jane tilted her head. "And she'd say, 'You always had to learn things the hard way, Will.'" He chuckled dryly, shaking his head. "But she'd be proud, too. Maybe she already is." As they ate, a few curious glances from park-goers reminded them that not everyone understood their little trio. An older white couple whispered as they passed the man, giving a slight frown, the woman visibly confused. But William didn't look away. He held his gaze steady and returned a small, deliberate smile. Let them wonder. Let them learn. After lunch, Nancy lay with her head on William's lap, eyes blinking slowly as the sun warmed her cheeks. Jane leaned back, hands behind her, and let the breeze sweep through her curls. William stroked Nancy's hair gently, thinking about how, just a few months ago, he had believed his life was over, that there was nothing left to live for. And yet, here he was, reborn, not through miracles, but through tiny human choices, an act of kindness, a shared meal, a promise kept. They stayed in the park for hours. Nancy chased ducks near the pond. Jane told a story from her youth that made them all laugh. William took a photo of them with a disposable camera that Nancy had insisted they buy. The day was ordinary in every way, and yet completely extraordinary. No judges, no doctors, no confrontations, just life as it should be. That night after dinner, Nancy curled up on the couch with a book, while William and Jane sat nearby sipping tea. Jane broke the silence. "You know," she began, "I've been thinking, maybe it's time I looked for work again. Not something big, just part-time. At the library, maybe. Nancy would love that." William raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure you're ready?" Jane nodded. "Yes, because for the first time in years, I don't feel like I'm drowning, and I want Nancy to see what strength looks like." He smiled, not as a benefactor or savior, but as a friend, an equal someone who had needed saving too. Later, Nancy wandered over, climbing onto William's lap. She reached up and touched his face with both hands, squishing his cheeks together. "You look funny like this, Grandpa." He laughed. "You little rascal." She leaned in, whispering softly, "I love you. Not because you're Robert's dad, just because you're mine." The words landed like a soft earthquake, shaking everything without breaking anything. He kissed her forehead. "And I love you, Nancy, with all the pieces I have left." The living room went quiet after that, not out of sadness, but peace. A kind of quiet that people spend lifetimes searching for. William looked out the window where the first stars were beginning to appear. The red toy car sat on the shelf beside the framed court order and a crayon drawing of the three of them under a crooked sun. "It's a good night," he murmured. And it was. A good night at the end of a long, hard road. Not perfect, not fairy tale, but real. Full of cracks, yes, but also full of light. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for staying with us through this entire journey. If this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you of love loss, second chances, or the quiet strength that carries us forward, then we are honored to have shared it with you. Stories like this one, filled with empathy, transformation, and forgiveness, remind us how powerful human connection can be, even between strangers. Wherever you are in the world, your presence here matters. We'd love to know, where are you watching from? This has been more than just a tale of grief and healing. It's about resilience, about the twists life throws at us, and how love, unexpected, imperfect, but deeply real, can find its way through the cracks. If this emotional story spoke to you, if it made you feel reflect, or simply warmed your heart, consider giving it a like, subscribing, or leaving a comment. Your support helps keep stories like this alive. We are truly grateful you're here. We'll see you again soon for another heartwarming video. Until then, stay kind, stay open, and take care.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.